All right, guys, so today we're going to be talking about classical China. I would love for you to go and watch the video by Mr. Green on Chinese civilization. And I always start off giving you a background. China's culture dates back more than 6,000 years, and it's one of the world's oldest cultures. China also has the largest population of any nation. Its population is made up of more than 50 ethnic groups that speak several languages and many dialects. The diversity of Chinese people reflects the diversity of the land and climate. The Honghe, or the Yellow River, stretches across China more than 2,900 miles. The river carries its rich yellow soil or silt from Mongolia to the Pacific Ocean. The Changjiang, or Yangtze River, is longer, and it flows about 3,400 miles across central China. The river then empties into the Yellow Sea. Um, sorry, then empties into the Yellow Sea, and the cultivated valleys of these two rivers became one of the greatest flood producing areas of the ancient world. However, China is not just the land of the fertile fields. Only 10% of the total land area is suitable for farming. In comparison, 19% of the United States can be farmed. Much of the rest of China is mountains and deserts. They surround the country on its northern and western frontiers. This forbidding landscape has a big effect on Chinese life. It has played an important role in the country's history. Land barriers, the mountains and deserts, isolated or separated the Chinese from peoples of other parts of Asia. Peoples of Mongolian, Indo European, and Turkish backgrounds lived in the border regions created by these barriers. The contact between these groups and the Chinese were often marked by conflict. The northern frontier of China became a key area for conflict in Asia. For years, Chinese armies tried to protect their land from invasion there. China's climate varies from region to region. The climate is based on elevation, or height above the sea level, and on monsoons. In the winter, the monsoons blow cold, dry air from the mountainous regions, and in the summer, the monsoons from the south across the seas bringing in rain. This alternation, or change back and forth between the dry season and the wet monsoons, creates significant temperature differences between winter and summer. So, of course, China was centered along the Honghe, or the Yellow River, and it's isolated due to those mountains that we've talked about, the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert up here in the north, the Plateau of Tibet, which is on the other side of these Himalayan mountains. As you can see here, you do have a lot of desertous land in China. Um, the Gobi Desert between China and Mongolia is the fifth largest desert in the world, and it's also the coldest. Most of Western China is very dry due to it being on the opposite of the windward, or the leeward side of the Himalayan mountains. These mountains block rain producing weather that casts a shadow of dryness behind them, giving us the Gobi Desert. Um, Sixth longest river in the world, also called the Yellow River due to the high amounts of silt within the river. It's also called the River of China's Sorrows because of the deadly floods it can produce. Now, some background on China. I want to talk to you about that first before we go into the dynastic cycle, mandate of heaven, and all that good stuff. So, historians have traditionally dated the beginning of Chinese civilization to the founding of the Shi dynasty, or family of rulers. Little is known about this dynasty that was founded more than 4,000 years ago. It was replaced by a second dynasty, the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty ruled from about 1750 to 1045, and during that time, China was mostly a farming society. It was ruled by aristocracy, and aristocracy is an upper class whose wealth is based on land and whose power is passed from one generation to the next. The main concern of the aristocracy was war. Archaeologists have found evidence of impressive cities from the period during the Shang dynasty. The Shang kings may have had five different capital cities. They finally settled on Hanyang, just north of the Honghe in northern or north central China. Excavations reveal huge city walls, royal palaces, and large royal tombs are there. The Shang king ruled from the capital city Anyang. His realm, or area of rule, divided into territories. Aristocratic military leaders, called warlords, were chosen by the king to govern these territories. The king also had the power to remove the warlords. The king was responsible for defending the realm. He controlled large armies, which often fought on the borders of the kingdom to, keep those other people we were talking about earlier out. The ritual sacrifices performed at the king's death are evidence of his importance. Early Chinese kings were buried in royal tombs, and they were accompanied by the corpses of their faithful servants. The royal families occupied the top Shang society. The aristocracy came next. The aristocrats waged war and served as officials. They were also the chief landowners. Majority of the people were peasants who farmed the aristocracy's land, and in addition to aristocrats and peasants, the Shang society also included a small number of merchants, artisans, and slaves. The Chinese believed supernatural forces helped rulers in world affairs. To communicate with the gods, the priests made oracle bones. These were large bones, such as shoulder blades of a cow, on which a priest carved questions asked by the rulers. For example, will the king be victorious in battle? Heated metal rods were stuck into the bones, causing them to crack, and the priest interpreted the shapes of the cracks in the bones as answers from the gods. The priest then recorded their interpretations of the answers on the bones. The early Chinese believed in life after death, and from this belief came the veneration of or deep respect for and devotion to one's ancestors. This is commonly known in the West as ancestor worship. The Chinese burned replicas or exact copies of objects so that the objects would accompany the dead on their journey to the next world. This practice continues today in many Chinese communities. The early Chinese believed it was important to treat the spirits of their ancestors well because the spirits could bring good or bad luck to living members. And the Shang are perhaps the best remembered for their mastery of bronze casting. Thousands of bronze objects have been found in tombs from the Shang period, and they are among the most admired creations of Chinese art. And then we get to the Zhao dynasty. According to legend, the last of the Shang rulers was a wicked tyrant who swam in ponds of wine. This led to the ruler of the state of Zhao to revolt against the Shang. He then established a new dynasty. The Zhao dynasty was the longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history. It ruled for about 800 years. The Zhao dynasty continued the political systems of its rulers had overthrown. At the head of the government was the Zhao king. He was served by an increasingly large and complex bureaucracy or kingdom into territories governed by officials. These officials were members of the aristocracy. They were appointed by the king and were subject to his authority. Like the Shang rulers, the Zhao king was in charge of defense and commanded the armies throughout the country. The Zhao dynasty claimed it had authority to rule in China because it had the mandate of heaven. It was believed that heaven, which is an impersonal law of nature, kept order in the universe through the Zhao king. The king was the link between heaven and earth. So the king ruled by mandate or command from heaven. The concept of the heavenly mandate became a basic principle of Chinese government. The mandate of heaven could work both for and against the king. The king was chosen to rule because of his talent and virtue or moral goodness. He was responsible for ruling the people with goodness and efficiency. The king was expected to rule according to the proper way called the Tao. It was the Zhao king's duty to please the gods. This would protect the people from natural disaster. If the king failed in his duties, he could be overthrown and replaced with a new ruler. The theory of the mandate of heaven had an influence on politics. It established a right of revolution to overthrow a corrupt or dishonest ruler. It made clear that the king served as a representative of heaven, but that the king was not divine himself. Each founder of a new dynasty would say that he had earned the mandate of heaven. It was difficult to argue against this claim. To show the claim was wrong, someone had to overthrow the king. The mandate of heaven was so closely tied to the pattern of the dynastic cycles from the beginning of Chinese history to 1912. China was ruled by a series of dynasties. All of the dynasties went through a cycle of change. A new dynasty would establish its power and rule successfully for many years, and then it would begin to lose power, and as a result, there were rebellions or invasions. And when a new dynasty took over, the cycle began again. So, to recap that, a succession of ruling families, of course, is called a dynasties. Rulers are considered to be put in place by heaven. They're considered to be divine. They rule under a mandate of heaven, which is the emperor's right to rule as long as he is just. All right, the gods will keep him in power as long as he is good, virtuous leader. And this mandate of heaven led to the dynastic cycle, which we were just talking about. New dynasty brings peace and builds infrastructure, so builds roads, schools, temples, protects the people, gives land to the poor, good to the people within his realm. Then generations go by, that ruler gets corrupt. So then someone else claims to have the mandate of heaven. They go battle each other, overthrow. One overthrows the king, and then the new dynasty is put in place. That corruption, what I forgot to mention, that corruption, maybe they tax the people too much so that they can live a lavish lifestyle. They stop protecting the people from those warring tribes. They let the infrastructure decay, or they treat people unfairly. This leads to natural disasters. This leads to invasions and attacks. And this leads to somebody coming in and taking over. Okay. Now, going on with the Zhou dynasty, after almost 800 years, the Zhou dynasty collapsed. The Zhou, dynasty collapsed. Powerful states challenged Zhou ruler. In 403, civil war began. This started an age known in Chinese history as the period of the warring states. When we talk about Confucius, he's going to be an intellectual during this period, the period of the warring states. Warfare had also changed in China. Iron weapons, which were more powerful than bronze weapons, came into use. Cavalry or soldiers on horseback were armed with powerful crossbows, took control, and it created, oh, excuse me, I messed that up. I'm so sorry. All right, so Chinese soldiers on horseback, they had powerful crossbows, a Chinese invention of the 7th century, and eventually one of the warring states called the Qin took control, and it created a new dynasty in 221. The basic features of the Chinese economy and society began to take shape during the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou continued the pattern of land ownership of the Shang. The peasants worked on the lands owned by its lords. Each peasant family farmed an outer plot for its personal use and then joined with other families to work an inner plot for their lord. A class of artisans and merchants lived in walled towns. The towns were under the direct control of the local lord, and merchants did not operate freely but were considered the property of the local lord. There was also a slave class. The family was one of the most important institutions in Chinese society. As in most agricultural societies in ancient China, the family served as the basic economic and social unit. However, in China, the family took on an almost sacred quality. It became a symbol for the entire social order. There were a number of reasons for the importance of the family in ancient China. The need to work together on the land was one. Farming required the work of many people. This was especially true in growing rice, the chief crop of the region of the Changjiang and the provinces of the south. Children were essential to the family because they worked the fields. Later, sons took over the physical labor on the family plots and provided for their parents. The concept of family in China focused on the idea of filial piety. Filial describes a son or a daughter. Piety describes a display of great loyalty and respect for someone. Filial piety then refers to the duty of children to subordinate their needs and desires to those of their parents. More broadly, the term describes a system in which every family member has his or her place. As in other civilizations, male supremacy was key to the social system of China. Men were responsible for providing for their families, and in ancient China, men worked the fields. There were the warriors, the scholars, the government ministers, and women raised the children and worked in the home. Some women did influence politics, especially female members of the royal family. Significant economic growth and technological change, especially in farming, took place from the 6th to the 3rd centuries. Before that time, farmers had depended on rainfall to water crops such as rice and millet. By the 6th century, irrigation was widely used to water crops. Changes in farming methods also increased food production, and by the mid 6th century, iron was used in plowshare, which was part of a plow that cuts the soil. This made it easier to plow the land, and so it helped increase the land available for growing crops. Because of advances in farming tools and practices, more food was available, and as a result, China's population grew to as high as 50 million people during the Zhou period. Improved farming methods also played a major role in encouraging the growth of trade and manufacturing. Chinese silk was a key export. Chinese silk fragments from the period have been found throughout Central Asia as far away as Athens, Greece. They are clear indications of a very wide trade network. An important cultural contribution of ancient China was the creation of the Chinese written language. By Shang times, the Chinese had developed a simple script. It is the ancestor of today's highly complex written language. Chinese writing was primarily pictographic and ideographic. Pictographs are pictured characters that represent objects. For example, the Chinese character for mountain, sun, and moon represent the objects themselves. Ideographs are characters that combine two or more pictographs to represent an idea. For example, the ideograph for east presents a pictograph of the sun rising behind trees. Each Chinese character was associated with a sound. In other cultures, people eventually stopped using pictographs and ideographs. They adopted phonetic symbols, which represent speech sounds. The Chinese began to give phonetic meaning to some of their symbols. And although the Chinese language has evolved or changed continuously over 4,000 years, it has never entirely abandoned its original format. So, migratory invaders were invading China from the north. Qin Shi Huangdi, remember that he takes over after the Zhou dynasty. He begins the construction of the Great Wall of China under his new mandate, right? So that they could have protection from the Mongolians. The Silk Road, which we just talked about, was facilitated trade and it kept them in contact with cultures as far away as Rome. Due to the specialization of labor, they were able to create other things like silk clothing. Silk was a major export for them. That's why we have the Silk Road. They also have that civil service system based on merit, thanks to Confucianism, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and it's also in your video lesson. Um, Let me go back to this. The civil service system based on merit simply means that your civil service is based on, or government positions are based on educational qualifications, are based on your merit. And so from Chinese, after we get that specialization of labor, after we get the agricultural surplus, excuse me, and those specializations of labor, we get the creation of paper, porcelain, and silk. And remember, silk is your major export of China. I hope this helps you in your notes and on your questions. And if you have any problems, just give me a call. Thanks, guys.